So, one of the big reasons to actually use Blender over other modeling tools is their non-destructive modeling option. I got a donut here. You might have done the Blender Guru donut tutorial or seen it before. Mine's a little different though, because mine is actually, when you get down to it, just one single vert. Let me turn off all my little models. It's just that one and G. It's just this one vert. And in fact, all the parts of the model are just one single vert at the invisible end of the stage. Because I take one vert and I can throw a screw modifier on it, another screw modifier on it, a solidify modifier on it, a bevel modifier on it, subdivide it. I got my sprinkle. And then my icing, I do a displace modifier, I do a screw modifier, another screw modifier, another displace to give it the height, shrink wrap to put it to the donut or solidify, another subdivision, a displace, and then I actually apply some particles to the top of it. Then, when we get to the actual donut itself here, I have a displace modifier to give it my size, another screw, another displace to give me my shape, my screw modifier, my subdivision surface, and then another displace to give me my movement. And then I create a procedural texture here to give me that shape of the donut that I'm going to get. So this texture 1, which actually gives me changes to my shape based on its size and intensity. So that's an extreme example, but I want to show you how much you can really do with just one or two single verts. So let me pop into a new scene and show you what I'm talking about. So take my default cube here. Most of the modeling you're used to doing is, by this point, is what we call destructive. So I'm creating, say, a bevel, and I'm applying some geometry to that bevel, and I'm creating an individual result. But if I want to change that, so say I went back in, and I maybe made a little change here and there, and now I want to go back to change it. Well, I can't because it's been baked into the model. It's destructively changed the model. However, I can do the same thing with modifiers, because over here in the little modifier panel, which is modifier properties in my whole properties window, I can turn on the bevel modifier, and now I have something that I can set a number of segments. And if I want more segments or fewer, and I want it wider or smaller, I can all do that in here. But ultimately, I'm still working with the same basic shapes, meaning that this becomes a more flexible way to go. And when I have a modifier on something, if I say I and then E, it still tries to affect and adjust to the shape of whatever I'm doing. And there's a ton in here. And I'm going to go over some of the ones I use the most frequently. I use the array modifier, the bevel modifier. I use Boolean sometimes. I use decimate, edge split, mirror a ton. And I use screw and solidify, as well as a few other ones in here, triangulate, but I want to show you just the most important ones. So let's say, I want to give you a little tour of what some of these do and how we can use them. So let's say I want to make a object or shape. Well, most often than not, things are pretty symmetrical. So I like to make a dividing line down the middle, hit 3, delete X to delete these faces, and I can add a mirror modifier. Let's say I want to give it some thickness though, and I want to make it the thickness of a cube or something. Well, I can come to solidify. Solidify does exactly what it sounds like. It makes the object solid. Offset determines the direction, up or down, and then thickness determines how far. So if I set this to 2, well, now I got a cube, but it's still just being defined by these smaller shapes. Let's turn on up in here. I'm going to go into this little caret for display properties and turn on wireframe. It's easier to track. And now I can say, all right, let's take this and let's do that bevel again. So I'm doing a bevel. It's set to angle, however sharp the angle is. If I set it to no angle, it's going to bevel every edge. But I don't want it to bevel those middle edges. I just want it to bevel on an angle. 30 seems about right. And this is going to let me sort of change up the overall shape of it. Maybe now I want to say, you know what, I don't want this line in the middle here. So I can add what's called a decimate modifier and say planar. So if something's flat, get rid of those edges. And I can put this ahead of that or behind it, and it's going to do different things depending on how I do it. The advantage of working this way is, let's say I want to model something that's like a relatively flat piece of geometry, like a flat panel. So let's set its thickness to something more like I would expect from a nice little piece of geometry. And I'm also going to reduce our bevel size just a little bit. So if I'm holding shift, it's just making it easier for me to control it. So I can get almost like a sharper edge on everything. So now I'm going to go in and hit a couple of these tabs. Something I like to do is a lot of these. So like solidify and bevel, I can hit to these little symbols, which means they don't show up in edit mode. So I take a shape like this, and let's give it just a little bit more complexity. So maybe this is like an angled piece or a panel that I might find on a mechanical bit. Well, it's still going to produce for me a really nice, I'm going to turn this test off, I don't really want it. It's still going to produce for me a really nice result that's super easy for me to work on and make changes to. So I can save myself time by not extruding, instead of having a solidify. Now a tip on these, if you want to bake these into the model, all we have to do is hit apply all, and now it's actual geometry that we can work with. However, I like to leave that until the absolute last minute, because the longer I can keep these modifiers on my model, the more flexible I am in terms of working with their overall shape and changing how they look. Now I want to show you another one here that's really cool. It's one of my favorite things to do, and it's called the screw modifier. I talked a little about it a second ago, but especially when you're making cylindrical objects, it's so handy. So I'm going to start with the plane, and I actually don't want a plane. What I really want is one single vertice. So I'm going to take all of these selected, I'm going to hit M and go to center, so I just have one vertex at the center. And along my x-axis, I'm going to hit E and then middle click and just move this out. Because now I have two verts, one at the center and one at the outside. And if I apply to this a screw modifier, you'll see it produces a circle for me. And I can set in here how many steps I want there to be. And I can set a lot in terms of how I like. So if I want it to be like 32 sides, I can set it to a lot more sides. And if I want to go from here, let's pop into our orthographic front view. I can start hitting E, 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 and creating some really cool shapes. And let's set this one right back into the center. And now I'm able to make a cylinder that I can just edit to change the overall shape of, but I'm only changing one line. And one tip I like to use is, let's turn this off. I obviously want to keep these all lined up. So if I go to my tweak tool in the upper left-hand corner, I want to be able to move these, but not move them back and forth, because it actually really affects the geometry. I want to keep everything nice and even. So what I like to put on before this, let's turn it off. Let's add a modifier. And I'm going to do a mirror, and I'm going to stick this mirror modifier before the screw modifier. But instead of mirroring in the X, I'm actually going to mirror it in the Y-axis, even though that doesn't do anything. Because by turning clipping on, remember from when we did mirroring last time when we first worked on the treasure chest, this clipping will keep it from moving back and forth. So now I can turn this on, and I have a treasure chest, like not a treasure chest, I have like, can be making like a, a lamp or a bottle. And anytime I want more detail, I just Control R, add another little vert to something, and it can control or change the shape of it. And again, what's really cool about this is if I decide it has too few or too many sides, just a matter of changing my slider up until it gets the exact number of sides that I want. So 8 being relatively small, and something else being, something like 32 being pretty high. So there's a lot of options, and I'll be kind of going over some of these. You can always duplicate them or apply them from here individually if you want. You can apply all, if you turn on, I have this menu here, it's called apply all, and that's because if you go to your properties, I'm going to bring up my preferences, under add-ons is where we can add extra functions to stuff inside of Blender. And so one of the add-ons I like to use is called modifier. It's called modifier tools, and it just gives me these extra tools to apply or delete or turn on and off the visibility of things, as well as change up the full stack to like expand or collapse all the items in there. So you can find that in Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons. And we'll be doing quite a few add-ons in this class. Most of them ship with Blender. They're just not turned on by default, but I'll show you how to do those when you need to. So with that, I'm going to show you how to use some of these tools to make some interesting changes to your model.